Welcome to Curious City, the podcast from Glasgow Life Museums. I'm David Scott, and this is how it works. In each episode, we head out into the city, making connections and discovering the stories that surround us. This week, we're reclaiming some of the territory staked out in our last episode that explored light by taking you to some significantly darker places. The darkness, places and times and occasions of little or no light, that's our focus for this week. To help us explore the darkness this week is our guest, fashion historian, writer and curator, Mairi MacKenzie. Mairi, welcome back to the Burrell.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mairi, for our first time listeners, you've been with us before, but could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am a historian who specialises in the history of fashion. And it's not just the history of what was worn, but why people wore what they wore and the culture that goes around that. I'm based at Glasgow School of Art. I'm a research fellow there, and I curate exhibitions and publish books on the subject.
Mairi, that sounds like a great segue into our first stop this week, where we're finding out about someone who dressed in black to project a particular image of themselves.
The colour black can mean a lot of things in fashion. In some ways, it is identified with fashion itself. Think of a stereotypical designer wearing all black or a timeless little black dress. But what would a black dress have said about its wearer in the past? I'm here with Rebecca Quinton, curator of European Dress and Textiles, to talk about the 1622 portrait of Elizabeth Risley, Countess of Southampton, which hangs in the Burrell collection. The Countess is wearing a full-length black dress with pearls and gold detailing. It's very impressive. So, Becky, first of all, can you tell us who was the Countess of Southampton?
She had quite a racy early life. So she had originally been Elizabeth Vernon, and she served as a lady-in-waiting to the court of Elizabeth I. And then she started having an affair with the Earl of Southampton and ended pregnant. They got married, but this had been done without the permission of Elizabeth. So the pair of them were thrown into the Fleet prison. They did pay that off, but they were never received back into the favour of Elizabeth. Southampton himself is quite a enigmatic figure. He is possibly the fair gentleman of Shakespeare, and certainly was one of the patrons of Shakespeare. And then they go into the court of James VI and first, and he's quite good looking, so they find themselves back in favour.
I thought I recognised the Risley name, and I think that is from the Shakespeare connection, actually, so that's really interesting. So what was the significance of black as a colour for clothing at this time?
So there are a couple of reasons for wearing black. One of the key ones that we still use today is for mourning. And this goes back to the tradition of you being a wealthy woman who, after your husband has died, particularly if you're beyond childbirth, bearing age, that you might then actually go into a convent. Because, of course, with mourning, you've got to be wealthy, because you've got to be able to afford to have a new set of clothes. Most people would have just gone on wearing whatever they already had in their wardrobe and would get on with life. So that is one reason why she could be wearing it. But checking the dates, I'm not sure that it is the reason specifically for this portrait. So you had a major death at court. You'd had Anne of Denmark, who had died, but that was a few years earlier. Elizabeth's husband died, but 2 years later, as did her eldest son. So I suspect there is another reason that she is wearing black. So the other key reason for wearing black is that it was expensive. This is you showing off your wealth. We tend to think of expenses being the bright reds, the bright purples, but in fact, black was also. And the reason is that it's the dye. So black is a really tricky colour to get. Browns you can get, no problem. But black, to get a really, really coal black is really, really tricky. And it needed several dye baths to get that density. So each dye bath is more money. And then quite often you had to use a mordant, and that will just help the dye fix to the fibre. And with black, that will be a metal, which gives you this fantastic black. But it also means that actually the blacks can sometimes not last particularly long. And the other problem with black is actually sometimes the metal would just cause the black to start to split and degrade. So that is not only you showing that you've got money to buy black in the first place, but also to replace this clothing, because at some point it's going to go. So I think in this portrait, where she's surrounded by other colours, the rich velvet curtains behind her, the chair, which is a chair that she would have been given as a perk at the coronation, and they were only awarded to the peers. They are all contributing to this is a woman who is important and who is wealthy.
So is there anything else that this dress would have said about the Countess?
She is trying to put herself up as being an established figure, sober, modest, all these sorts of things. Because we remember she had that racy past. So I think this is her now established. She is middle-aged, late middle-aged, established. The family's established. They are no longer tarred with any of that issues that they had in the 1590s and early 1600s. This is 20 years on at the height of kind of power within the court.
Thanks so much, Becky.
Thank you.
Mairi, how do people use dark or black clothing today to shape their image or their reputation?
It would be hard to find someone who didn't have some black in their wardrobe, and the reasons they have black in their wardrobe will be hugely various. The connotations for black clothing are sometimes contradictory. So one person might wear it as a marker of elegance, something they might wear on a night out or to a special occasion. Somebody else would see it very specifically to do with mourning or a form of rebellion, or it might just suit them. So there are many reasons for it.
How long has black been with us?
Black has been a constant in the history of fashion and textiles. Obviously, the shade of black, because you do get different shades of black, has shifted as dye technologies have changed over the centuries. But Roman, Greek, ancient civilizations would have had black as part of their wardrobe. It would have had quite particular uses. Then, as you go into the early Christian era, it becomes very associated with religion. Then moving on into the association with virtue, high status, worn by nobility. And then moving into the 20th century, a colour of emancipation for women in the early 20th century, but also propriety and religion again.
And what are the connotations today?
So huge, it'd be difficult to narrow them down. For one person, it might be a sign of elegance. For another, it might be because they're into a particular genre of music. That's the beautiful thing about black. It means so many things to so many different people, and that's why it will be a constant in our wardrobes forevermore.
The evergreen nature of black, if you'll forgive me there. Okay, thank you, Mairi. Staying firmly in the dark for our next piece, we're going to be joining Alan and Laura to hear about nighttime activities in the past.
Hello Laura, it's good to see you again. What are we talking about today? What have you got for us?
So today we're talking about the nocturnal habits of people in the past.
That sounds interesting.
It sounds a bit risky, doesn't it?
A little bit for this time of the morning.
I promise it's PG. I work with a lot of objects in the collection, furniture in particular, and we have a lot of pieces of 16th and 17th century furniture related to sleeping, so big 4-poster beds. So it's been making me think about what did people do in the past at night time, particularly around sleeping and being in darkness, and what was it like for those people then. Today, I think most doctors would tell you it's good to get about 7 to 8 hours sleep in one block. But in the past, particularly in the 16th and 17th century, people often slept in 2 halves. It was known as your first sleep and your second sleep. You would go to bed round about maybe 9 o'clock, and then you would wake about 11. And there'd be a period of about 1 to 2 hours known as the watch, where you would get up and you would use that time to do things around the household, to connect with your family, perhaps pray, eat, whatever it might be. And then you would go back to bed for your second sleep, and you'd sleep for a couple of hours and you'd eventually get up in the morning to start your day. A lot of people talk about their first sleep and their second sleep in diary entries, court proceedings. It seems like something that's quite common across all sorts of levels of society.
Why do you think that changed from the first and the second to one continuous period of time?
You find that the change happens towards the 18th century and particularly into the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution happened. Suddenly you get people working in a very different way. They're working in factories with mass production. They're working long shifts. You also find as well the invention of artificial light, so things such as the gas light, the electric light, and that is able to extend people's waking hours, which means that when it comes to sleeping, they can condense it into one block. So the 2-sleep system really was about following the natural light that came from the sun rising and the sun setting, then using those darkness hours to your advantage. And prayer was important in the watching because in the dark, people really had a fear of supernatural forces. They felt that was when they were most vulnerable to spirits, ghosts and goblins. I mean, it's not too far off, monsters that lurk under the bed tonight. They believed that the devil was really at large at night time. So saying a prayer before bed or in the watching just helped to protect your soul at its most vulnerable state.
Could you give us a sense of what it looked like? Obviously it's like pre-gas lamps and obviously electricity. What would the rooms have looked like? How would they be illuminated? I'm imagining shadows and all sorts of terrifying things crawling over the walls.
Yeah. I think it depends on your living arrangements. So if you're perhaps a wealthier person, you might have your own bedroom with a bedstead, and that bed may have like hangings and linens. So you would draw those at night to not just keep in the heat, but also to protect yourself from those kind of spirits or ghouls that you're worried about. With regards to lighting the space, particularly in those watch hours, most people would use candles. If you were wealthy enough, you could afford a wax candle, beeswax. But for those that maybe were not so affluent, we're looking at rushes or tallow candles made of animal fat, so a little bit smelly. But most people would have had light through a fireplace or some form of fire. There was, however, a lot of conversation in the 17th century about light pollution, but not from orange street lamps, but instead from moonlight. Because physicians were very preoccupied with the idea of the sun being part of your natural waking and then going to bed again, they worried that any other form of light might rouse you from the sleep that was so important. And moonlight, if you've ever stood in it, it's very silvery and beautiful and very bright, and they worried that it would have the same effect as the sun. So some physicians wrote pamphlets to tell people, you know, you must have good shutters and good curtains to keep out that moonlight so it doesn't affect your sleep. So yeah, who would have thought the 17th century would be worried about light pollution from the moon?
Thinking, the darkness that you're describing there, what impact does it have on things like crime? For people who would take advantage of the darkness to move around?
There are certainly people who use that period of the watch, in particular that darkness, for nefarious deeds. We have events such as, theft, cattle hustling. We also have murder. There's quite some famous examples. There's a girl called Jane Routh in 1699 who talks about her mother welcoming two men to their house at the end of their first sleep, and her mother telling her to go back to bed early for a second sleep. When Jane wakes in the morning, her mother's not there, and it turns out, unfortunately, that she's murdered and her body's discovered a few days later. There's also a man called Luke Atkinson who lived in Yorkshire in the 17th century, and he was convicted of murder, and his wife dobbed him in and said that he actually used that watch hour to commit that murder, so he used that to commit all these crimes.
Because there'd be no evidence and obviously no CCTV.
Absolutely, no line of duty here.
Laura, always so great to talk to you. Thank you so much for today.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you so much.
Well, the night is dark and full of terrors, Mairi. The watch, a forgotten but fascinating habit. Would that suit you?
100%, because I am a natural night owl. And all my life I've battled against it. I've tried to be a morning person. I've read articles on how to become a morning person. But my body clock always rebels against it.
And there's maybe somewhat, we're surrounded by a bit of a bias towards morning people.
Absolutely. I feel that all the time. The time that society is structured around is the working day. The time that meetings start at, the time that appointments are at in the morning doesn't suit everybody. It can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the working day, but we also, through research, understand that the idea of sleeping at night and being awake during the day is something that is seen as proper, and being awake at night and asleep during the day is something that's seen as being improper.
I'm afraid it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon.
I don't think so, but from a personal viewpoint, I think it's important to understand where you sit on that spectrum.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. We're staying at Burrell again for our next piece this week, and we're looking at a painting that explores another type of darkness, grief. I met with our European art curator, Pippa Stevenson-Sitt, to hear about the story of this painting and a little bit about the story of the man who painted it. Well, for our next piece this morning, we're standing at a gallery inside the Burrell collection that deals with themes of death and how death is viewed by different cultures all across the world. I'm joined today by Pippa. Could you introduce yourself for us, please, Pippa?
Hi, I'm Pippa Stevenson-Sitt and I'm curator of European art.
Our theme today is the dark or darkness, and we're here to talk about an artist who definitely explored those themes during his life. Pippa, what are we looking at?
So what we have before us is a painting in a bright gold frame, landscape in format, and it's quite a visually dark painting. It's painted in greys and browns and blacks, and if you look closer you can see there's a woman lying face down on the floor, and she's just lying in absolute desperation and despair on the ground.
Can you tell us a little bit about the artist?
So this was painted by an artist called Matthias Maris. He was the Dutch artist who was born in 1839. Maris actually lived quite a tortured life. He was well known at the start for his quite realistic pictures. He painted landscapes, he did figurative pictures, and those were very successful, particularly with the American market. He thought of these pictures as being ones that would pay the bills, but they weren't the pictures that really inspired him. And then later in life, he went on to really develop the art that was really true to himself. These were darker themes. They weren't realistic. They were very much paintings of his inner life, often very mysterious, ethereal.
Pippa, this painting's had different titles.
When Maris painted it in 1887, it didn't actually have a title, but his art dealer and his friend Jan van Wisseling gave it the title Grief. And art dealers often do this because, it makes a painting more understandable, it gives it some kind of narrative. In fact, Maris could be quite critical of these titles that were given, and he said, "This painting is no picture, it is my own misfortune which is in it." Maris was saying that what he's representing isn't in fact a woman lying on an altarpiece, lying on the ground. It's actually his own misfortunes.
When you look at it, what do you see? What do you feel?
I just feel an intense sadness, actually, when I see it. I think it's a really good example of how art can take you to a different place, a different time, and not just geographically, but inside someone's minds.
It takes us to perhaps a very, very dark place. Is that reflective of what we know about Maris's state of mind?
Yeah, it certainly is. Maris suffered what we may today describe as depression. We don't know whether he would have diagnosed himself as being depressed, but he became quite isolated. People close to him died. He was very disillusioned with the art world. He was also very disillusioned with the world in general. He went to some dark places, I would say.
Quite a contrast between Maris and some of the other artists Burrell collected.
Yeah, absolutely. He collected many works by Degas, by Rodin, by Crawhall. But one of the greatest numbers of artworks he collected by any artist was by Matthias Maris, and he bought 52 paintings by him. So this adds a great depth to Burrell as a collector, I think. And this picture, Burrell hung it above the fireplace in his study, so we know that he lived with this picture. He didn't just keep it in store, he didn't lend it to another collection. He looked at this picture every day.
With modern eyes, it's very hard to date the painting.
Yes, you're right. It's got this kind of universal quality. And, that would have been deliberate, I'm sure. Maris wanted to remove it from narrative as much as he could, remove it from time and place, so it just becomes this strange kind of image that's floating there and could be from any time.
What is Maris showing us about being human in this painting?
Maris is trying to convey absolute, utter desperation, sadness, what it feels like to be completely broken.
Obviously, stylistically it's very different, but it's not dissimilar to something like The Scream.
Yeah.
Where it's just this mute, frozen voice.
Yeah, yes, this work certainly, speaks to things like Munch's The Scream. It also reminds me a bit of Mark Rothko, even the way that it's painted, the kind of layers and the texture of the surface.
There's this depth to it. It almost feels like it's kind of gently vibrating.
Because of the way he's painted it, he used quite a scrubby kind of technique with his paintbrush. And it does feel like a vibration, like the paint's kind of almost moving as you move towards it and back further from it. And showing this picture next to Mark Rothko would be incredible, actually.
How are Maris's works viewed today?
He's fallen into obscurity. I think people find his art a bit challenging to look at. It is different, it's difficult. You're not easily satisfied by what you're seeing. So he's an undervalued artist. But actually in 2017, the Rijksmuseum produced a really big exhibition just on Maris, and of course the Burrell were a major partner because we have so many of the works, and since then he's become better known. Maris is absolute hidden gem, and the Burrell is definitely the place to discover him.
Pippa, thank you.
That's okay. It's a pleasure.
Mary, it's a very, very powerful piece. What does this piece conjure for you?
This is the first time I've seen it. There's something very visceral about this painting that embodies what it's supposed to, and that is grief. It's impenetrable. At first I couldn't see the figure in it. It just seemed like an impressionistic view of what grief might be, but the more you look at it, you can see the figure there, you can see the pain that they're in, and anyone who has endured grief before will be able to relate to what that picture is conveying.
How does it make you feel?
A bit nervous, actually. It's not a good feeling. I felt it very deeply, but I don't think I'd be able to articulate exactly what that feeling is. In the same way that with grief, it's rock solid, but it's also intangible. It's the same way I feel about that painting. It'd be really hard for me, and I actually don't want to define how it makes me feel, because there's something about it that is abstract and impressionistic and relates it very closely to how grief actually feels.
That's lovely. Thank you. Before we head into our final piece this week, let's look back over where we've been. We started off looking at the use of black to signify wealth and respectability. We found out about sleeping patterns in the past. Then, off into the darkness again with one of Sir William Burrell's favourite paintings. To finish the show this week, we're not getting any brighter, I'm afraid. To round us out, we're looking at the Black Death, the plague that killed nearly 50 million people in the 1300s. To explore an explicit Glasgow connection to the plague, Michael met Ed Johnson, our curator of medieval and Renaissance art at the Burrell last week.
Ed, can you tell us a bit about the Black Death?
Yes, so the Black Death commonly refers to the bubonic plague outbreak of the mid-14th century, and that's a pandemic that tore through Western Eurasia and North Africa between the years 1347 to 1351, may have killed up to about 2/3 of the European population alone, perhaps as many as 50 million people. But what's not always realised is that actually this outbreak didn't happen in isolation, and bubonic plague was actually to revisit Europe with successive devastating epidemics for hundreds of years. So in Britain, we might think about the Great Plague of 1665 to 1666, for example. But plague was, in fact, actually constantly popping up in Britain and Europe throughout the whole of the medieval and early modern period.
We're standing next to this carved alabaster figure of St. Roch. Ed, can you tell us a bit about this object and who St. Roch was?
Yeah, so as you say, it's a figure of St. Roch, and he's carved in alabaster. He stands about 40 centimetres high, and he was made in England in the 15th century. And if you look, there are traces of original paint all over the surface that help bring this figure to life. And he's shown as a bearded young man. He's dressed as a pilgrim, so he's complete with his staff, his hat, satchel, and a pair of sturdy boots. And Roch is really just one of several saints to whom the anxiety-ridden Christian population may have turned to in these tumultuous times. Now, unfortunately, the legend and history of St. Roch is quite confused, and there's even debate about when he may have been alive. But he may have lived in the mid-14th century, being born around the time of that initial outbreak of Black Death. But sources tend to agree that he was born into a prosperous and powerful family in Montpellier in France, but he rejected his privileged life and he distributed his goods and his wealth amongst the poor before he set out on a religious pilgrimage towards Rome. Which is how we see him in this alabaster as a young pilgrim. And the legend then continues that as he enters Italy, he finds the country in the grip of a plague epidemic. And rather than flee, Roch selflessly decides to dedicate himself to the care of the sick. So not surprisingly, he eventually succumbs to the disease himself, and he withdraws from society to die in isolation in the forests around Piacenza in northern Italy. However, while awaiting this seemingly inevitable demise, he's discovered by a hunting dog, and that actually appears on his feet in the carving. You can see it here between his legs. This dog brings him bread, and it offers him some relief by licking the wounds on his thighs. Fortunately for Roch, this rather helpful dog, like a medieval lassie, then leads his owner to him where he was taken into his master's house, and against all odds makes a full miraculous recovery, and then he dedicates the rest of his life to the care of the sick. But then there's this rather bizarre twist at the end of his story that sees him wrongly imprisoned as a spy as he tries to return to Montpellier, and he dies in captivity. But his true identity is then recognised upon his death when an angel is said to have appeared in his cell, revealing that prayers to Roch would help the stricken overcome the plague or the pestilence, as it was commonly referred to then.
So you've spoken, Ed, about St. Roch being a real saviour to people. Why do you think people turn to St. Roch?
Well, it's not really until the 15th century, when plague was again cutting through Europe, that Roch's cult truly began to flourish. As people start to turn to him, I suppose, in the hope of gaining some comfort in the face of this devastation, loss and uncertainty. And in the 15th century, it was reported that devotion and prayers to Roch had actually facilitated the subduing of an outbreak of plague in Constance in Germany in 1414. And then the cult grew even further during an outbreak of plague in northern Italy in the late 1470s. And eventually the cult spread throughout Europe and eventually even to England, where this alabaster piece was carved.
In what ways do people identify with St Roch today?
So today, St Roch continues to be venerated right across the world as a healer saint. And his protection is sought not just against the plague, but all manner of other infectious diseases. And notably, in recent years, of particular interest, his name was regularly invoked in prayers offered in response to the COVID pandemic.
Am I right in saying there's a strong Glasgow connection with St Roch?
Yeah, that's right, actually. So if you go around Glasgow, you'll find churches, schools, community groups, and even football clubs in the city that carry the name of St Roch, or as he is sometimes uniquely known in Glasgow, St Rollox. And in fact, there's even an area of the city which is known historically as St Rollox, and it's supposed that this unique name possibly derives from a corruption of St Roch's Loch, which would have been a small body of water which we think once stood beside a now lost chapel in Glasgow dedicated to the saint, which was built in the early 16th century, in fact not long after this alabaster figure was carved.
That's great that such history can be told through an object like that, Ed, and also interesting to learn about the connections to modern day Glasgow as well. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Yeah, no problem, thanks for having me.
So interesting. What does that mean to you? What does that bring up for you when we talk about the Black Death?
Two things. The first is, as a child, I knew a lot about the plague, and I don't know why that was, whether it was part of our curriculum at school or whether it was just something I was fascinated by. But as a child, and a lot of my friends were the same, we knew a lot about the bubonic plague, and it was a big fear. The second thing it makes me think of, I am researching the history of perfume at the moment, and the idea that smells would protect us from disease. During the Great Plagues, pomanders and various forms of aromatic material were used mistakenly in the belief that they would repel the plague. So the pomanders that we think of today as being associated with Christmas, an orange with cloves studded into it, had its origins as a prophylactic against the plague. Perfumery and the history of perfumery has always been closely aligned with the history of medicine. And aromatherapy is the most obvious way that we see it in contemporary culture. For example, the extraction of perfumes and rose perfumes.
It's so fascinating, that link. I mean, I don't think it's something that occurs to many people today. Aromatherapy is seen as this very much this lesser form.
Even if you think about how we feel about our personal perfumes, the way people talk about the perfumes they might go to a department store and buy is very exalted. We talk about our perfumes as though they're part of us and they add something to our being. And that's absolutely no different from the way they were spoken about in the times of the Roman Empire. It's very much bound up with a person's identity. And you can also see it in how territorial people become about the perfumes that they own. They don't want to reveal what they wear, or they get annoyed if their friend buys the same one as them.
Thank you, Mairi. That's it for this very dark episode of Curious City. We covered some really interesting ground this week on a journey into the darkness. Power dressing, the history of sleep, grief, and the Black Death. Huge thanks to Mairi MacKenzie for being our curious guest this week. See you next week on Curious City.